Take it away, Ray.
Righto, here we go. Here we go. And good morning, friends. And I hope we're feeling very well today. It is December and it's starting to get cold, growl, and things like that. But today we all will be listening to someone I don't think many of us have met before. I am talking of Oliver Robinson, who is going to speak to us today about, I think, why and how he discovered Quakers. Oliver.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you, friends. It's good to see you all. Um, I've sort of come a long way, I suppose, in Quaker terms, because I started off um, as a child not having any religion. My parents weren't religious. We weren't brought up as anything. But my granny was a Quaker, and so we knew about it. And my mother hadn't been brought up although my granny was a Quaker since a child, my mother wasn't brought up as one because my granny married a Presbyterian minister, and as the minister's wife, she had to go to church, as did the children. But apparently, as soon as he retired, she went straight back to Quakers again. And one of the things she would do is she'd take us along to meeting occasionally when we visited her, and that was okay. But I mean, like the sort of children's bit where you're doing colouring or something was okay, but then there were these grown-ups, they were just sitting there. They weren't doing anything. Um, and it was a bit of a mystery. But the other thing she did is she encouraged her meeting to support her to take her grandchildren, not just me, but all her grandchildren that she could, to what were then the summer gatherings, but have now sort of evolved into the residential yearly meetings. And I've heard the summer gatherings described as sort of a big Quaker holiday where you're residentially on a university for a week. There wasn't Quaker business and discernment. It was the sort of pure community, spiritual fellowship, um, and those kind of deepening and enjoyable activities. And they had, as they continue to do actually, as British Quakers continue to do, exceptionally good children's programs. Good enough that although these summer gatherings only happened every 4 years, 4 years later we all said, "Oh, Granny, can we go again?" And 4 years later we all said, "Oh, Granny, can we go again?" And I've been reflecting on this because um, the reason that I started attending Quakers is after the one I went to when I was 17. Then I'd had such a good time. I was so sad to have left it that I started going to meeting to try and get some of it back. Um, and it is noticeable, I think, that you have a number of people who have very powerful formative experiences at children's events, particularly children's residential Quaker events, which can really sort of bind them into Quakers for the rest of their life, or certainly maintain a strong, close connection, even though they're not attending worship every week. And I think it's because they manage through the activities to help people to get people to feel very close, very close to other people very quickly, very open. And I think that actually there's a really important part of faith which is about truth and openness to God. Um, there was a Quaker in yearly meeting a few years ago who was talking about when they first went to meeting, and um, you know, they talked about bringing themselves. What else could I do? What else could I bring? And actually, I think that's essential. I think that unlike relationships with other people, a relationship with God, a relationship with the divine, relies on that openness. You can't fool yourself. You can't fool God in that way. And that the more of yourself you're able to bring, the more relaxed and open you can be, the deeper the spiritual experience. And I've certainly noticed that the Quaker meetings, the Quaker communities over the years that I've had the strongest link to, have also been the ones where I've had the strongest community, the strongest connection with the other people involved. And I think it's because of that openness, that radical openness and honesty that it brings. And so this is why I think that actually the things like Quakers being a faith that is friendly and supportive to LGBT people, to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people, is really important, because actually, if there's this important part of yourself that you're having to hide from when you're going to meeting or to church from your fellow parishioners, then it really, I think it will have a deleterious, damaging effect on your ability to do that communion, that connection to God and the divine. And going back to me, then I was in London at the time, and I went around. One of the joys of London is that there were multiple meetings, and so you can try out different ones and see what type of meeting works for you. And there are ones which work differently, which are quieter or louder, bigger, smaller, stronger focus on work in the world, stronger focus on sort of mysticism or discussion or whatnot. But then I think the next big leap in my journey into Quakers came when I was at university in Glasgow. And there, one of the things they had there is they had a very good system of oversight, pastoral care, where I've seen it in other meetings, but they had each person that connected with the meeting was assigned a person responsible for their pastoral care from the team, and so my one invited me to go and visit them one day, and just to get to know me, to be welcoming, and also when you're a student at university, then sort of someone giving you a good meal and so on is very welcome, and a combination of a very good connection to them, but also her son, who was 10 at the time, took a great shine to me, and so would be very often sort of saying, Mum, can Oliver come home with us? And so after meeting, and so later on he became more confident about me and would just sort of phone up and say, "Hey, you coming over now?" "Yes, you are. Come on." But that having a connection, I think, again with Quakers, beyond just meeting, and I think that's an important bit, that you can, if you go and see people at meeting and speak to them with tea and coffee afterwards and then go home, it creates one level of connection. If there are other things you're doing, you're seeing them in their houses, you're doing other activities together, it creates a very different level of depth of connection. And and the other community that I became involved with at that time was Young Friends General Meeting, which is the national gathering for young adults, 18 to 30-ish, 35-ish. And they, in many ways, the number of hours you spend with them is probably similar to what you get if you go to meeting every week for a year. But it's a very different setup, because their main meetings happen 3 times a year at a meeting house somewhere around the country. Everyone's sleeping on the floor. We cook food, communally. There are worship activities, there are business activities, there are spiritual activities, there are opportunities for fun. And effectively, it's a very different experience spending 48 solid hours with people, particularly when you're doing things like eating together. And the power, I think, of eating is really important, which I'll come back to in a minute. I don't think it's a surprise that one of the main sort of regular main Christian rituals around communion is based on a meal that Jesus had with his disciples. And the and one of the things that I think came out of all that is applying for membership of Quakers, and this was something where again it was my what was then called overseer, my pastoral care friend, who who asked, "Have you considered this?" And I think there is something powerful about that invitation, that it's not something where we as the meeting entirely stand back and let it be purely one person's decision. It is about a relationship and recognizing a different kind of relationship or different depth of relationship, and that it's important that it works and is valuable for everyone involved. It's not just about one person's individual journey, it's about one person's journey into and with that Quaker community, that meeting, that area meeting. And I feel like it was definitely the right thing to do, because I went to the area meeting where they happened to be, where they were discussing it. Obviously, I went out of the room when it happened, when they were considering nominations, membership applications. And then I came in and they said, yes, we accept you're now a member. And I didn't feel anything. I've just heard I've described it in the past like the biggest non-event of my life. But I think that was right, because I think that showed that it was just an outward reflection of something that was already there internally, that was already there on the inside. A bit like Quaker marriages, or a public recognition of a connection and a relationship that's already there internally between the people. And then the next thing that happened, the next step of my journey towards being in Quakerism where I am now, is that I was still in Glasgow. I'd finished university. I was doing a job processing checks for Abbey National Bank, and which was an interesting job, because it was the kind of job which anybody could do, and therefore you did have anybody doing it. You had all sorts. You had a real mix of people doing that work. But while I was doing that, then a job opportunity came up, which was being a 1-year program assistant at the Quaker United Nations Office in Geneva. And they have they've had for decades this system of having 1-year assistants who go and work on, well, at the time it was either peace or human rights or economic issues, trade. The subjects have changed now. There's a climate change one now, and some of the others are not. I don't have a PA at the moment. But I was successful in applying for the Human Rights Programme assistant, and that was powerful, because I think it showed me a lot about the practical putting into practice in the world of Quaker values and how they work. And so I'd mentioned a bit earlier about food, and one of the sort of signature methods that the Quaker UN office, QUNO, uses is these quiet diplomacy dinners, lunches or dinners, where they invite a set of diplomats, or diplomats plus NGO staff plus UN staff, whoever they think needs to be in that particular conversation, to a meeting to talk about an issue. It's always held over food, because people are more relaxed and more open when they're eating. They are held almost exclusively at the Quaker House in Geneva, which is an old house, is an old townhouse, so it doesn't feel like an office. It feels like you're at home, and and therefore the nature and the quality of the discussion is different. And one of the ways, there have been various wise things that other people have said about it over the years, but I think a couple of the things that I particularly liked, one of them was talking about trying to make people comfortable enough to have uncomfortable conversations. And that being that being the aim of the atmosphere we want to create. Because actually people, the diplomats being able to say, well, this is the real reason underlying what we're saying in the public forums, is actually really helpful for working out, okay, well, this is what you need, or this is where you might be able to move or not. And the second bit that somebody talked about was it being a way of, because a lot of discussions happen at a very like head intellectual level at the UN. And this is a way of engaging people at an emotional level without being emotional at them. So I think sometimes, NGOs actually, the civil society groups in particular, can make the mistake of thinking if we show you just how upset and how angry we are, then you will have to do something. And sometimes it works, but quite often, particularly because the UN isn't, those negotiation spaces aren't a place where that's experienced very much. It can also mean people sort of back off and shy away. And whereas what QUNO does is helping to sort of bring people into thinking in that way. So my all-time favorite example of that was one of the quiet diplomacy dinners that was being had about climate change. And at the start, and they had like I think candles in the middle, and they had a bit of paper on in front of everybody's place. And then at the start, they got asked to write down the name of someone they knew who was already or would be affected by climate change. And and it varied from things like my grandchildren to this girl this girl I met on the beach in the Caribbean. And then we put them all in the middle, and then my colleague said, okay, so this is who we're working for. And that ability to connect people with the human aspect of it, I think is very helpful for moving conversations into a different space and in a different way. Now, QUNO does many other things as well. It does. They do reports. They suggest language for resolutions. They go along to the meetings. They work on negotiations. They provide evidence for reports. But that's one of the things which is unusual, and it also means that among the non-governmental groups, they have an unusually high level of access to government figures, because that they go and actively try to speak to them, whereas lots of the charitable campaigning organisations don't. They speak among themselves or speak at the UN and at the governments. I'm going to skip over about 10 or 15 years at this point, about 10 years, and just talk about the one last thing, which is about where I am now. And so now I'm actually working for British Quakers in Britain, the yearly meeting. And my in many ways my sort of career is sort of ping pong between working for Quakers and not working for Quakers, and the role I've got and the role I'm doing now is the current job title is Head of Witness and Worship. In old money, it's what used to be the General Secretary of Quaker Peace and Social Witness, and the General Secretary of Quaker Life, which supports Quaker communities, sort of smushed together. And the reason for that was wanting to get away from this idea of there are people who are sort of being Quaker and people who are doing Quaker, and never the twain shall meet. Because actually we know that there are people who come to Quakers through action and activism. There are people who go on a march and see a Quaker banner. And you have people who are Quakers whose faith is deepened through witnessing the world. And we're seeing that actually quite a lot at the moment, with things like Quakers who are engaging in protests or being at risk of, or actually arrested, and go the deep sort of testing and threshing and discernment processes they go through themselves and with their meetings to try to discern, is this the right thing for me to be doing? And there's a real value which meetings do, and I think in some ways the yearly meeting does as well, in a different way, about that accompaniment. And I think it can be very easy sometimes for us to think that, you know, we need to be the main character. We need to be the one who has the idea, who does the thing, who is at the forefront. Whereas actually there are lots of different roles that can be played. I'm not a particularly good Bible scholar or Bible reader, but I was very struck did read some months ago about the early bits of Exodus about Moses, and one of the things that happened is the fact that we think of Moses as this prophet and who did the lot. Actually, there's this whole bit when he's having his first conversations with God, and God is calling on him to go and be prophetic. He's like, apart from the "please don't make me do this, I don't want to do it." Then he also says, "But I can't speak well," and God says, "That's okay. Your brother Aaron, he will speak. I will speak to you, and you will speak to Aaron, and he will speak to the people." And so actually, Moses was not this great public speaker. He had the ideas, but there was another person who was actually putting it out there. And it's like, I remember being told about when you had some Quakers who were on trial for I think this was for trying to stop a plane taking off with migrants to be deported. And so you had some people who were Quakers and non-Quakers who were on trial. You had some Quakers who went and listened and were sitting in the public gallery in the court to be there alongside them in the trial, and others who were outside. You had some who'd been writing to their MPs about it and trying to raise awareness and understanding about it. You had some who offered accommodation because not everyone lived locally who was on trial. The airport was local, but they weren't all. You had some people who made soup in the meeting house at the end of the court day. They'd have somewhere to go to and a hot meal to have. And all of those being part of activism and accompaniment. And this idea that, there is a role for all of us to play, and that, building community very often happens when you have a shared task to do together. And so trying to find ways which may be less spectacular than that, to help deepen faith, to deepen action, and drawing on the experiences that I and others have had over the years is what I'm spending my time with Quakers doing now. Thank you, friends, and I'm welcome to have any conversation that you wish.
Thank you, Ali. That was, I don't know if what you wish to be called, Ollie, Oliver,
I
Mr.
answer to
Robertson.
all of those. No, not Mr. Ollie and Oliver both work fine.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It was interesting, really. For 20 years of my Quakerism, had been involved with the children and young people's groups of nationally. So I was one of those people who organised organised what was going on. And we used to get frustrated occasionally because you'd have friends come out to us and see what we're doing. And they would say, "Oh, you're doing the children." As if it was, kind of something that we would just do. We were childminders and that type of thing. And a lot of us felt we were doing quite a lot more than that. And as you expressed earlier, well, thank you very much for it. It does give this old Quaker ego quite a boost to hear things like that. So thank you. Uh, questions from other people, I think, now. And I will leap in occasionally, I think, friends.
See,
I'm really sorry. I don't know if you can hear me even, but the connection is so bad at my end. In the end, I thought it was better to stop recording because I could hear it saying recording stop recording started, and I thought it was interrupting Oliver more. So I'm hoping that David, you've got a recording. Thank goodness.
I hope so too.
Yeah, we hope. I really enjoyed the bits I could hear, Oliver, and I will be able to listen to the recording later on. Thank goodness, So, but I am anyway.
Yeah,
So,
Oliver, it's great that you're bringing your experience as a child and in some ways an observer because you're coming with your family and your experiences of working with the Quakers in Geneva. It's wonderful to get these perspectives. Part of what's great about these talks is getting to meet Quakers who we might see in a meeting and share a pleasantry over tea and biscuits with, and to hear about others in depth. And it's really it's great to hear your story. I'm not sure. I haven't got a question framed at the moment, but just it's great to hear you. It's lovely to hear your story. You can say some more if there's more that you would like to add to it. That would be really great. What else is there in your I would say in your personal experience of Quakerism as opposed to being active with it? How does it contribute to you as a spiritual being and as a human being?
I'm happy to go into that, but I wonder if there's anything else first that people want to add, because I realise that that might take us down a slightly different path in case there are things that we want to say on what's come already.
Mm.
Where do you think Quakers are going? Basically, the reason I ask that is because I've had a bit of a problem accepting the laying down of sufferings, because I think it is nearly a revising chamber, and I think Quakers need that bit, but uh, it gives me quite a stop to try and process that. I think.
I realise that also takes us down a different path, but I will actually start answering things. Um, Let me deal with the second one first. Um, I'm not a particularly good sort of, soothsayer or future seer. Um, I think that one of the things I'm aware of is that, a lot of the ways that we're set up were things that were developed when it was, from the times when some of the area meeting parameters and boundaries were related to, I've heard, either how far you could get on horseback, or where in a day, or what the remit of the relevant courts that Quakers got taken to in the 17th century were. And obviously there's been some changes, but but there are also things like representative bodies, like the Meeting for Sufferings as one of them, as a sort of national representative council, and also the representative bodies for Quaker Life and QPSW and so on. Then those are much more necessary where it's impossible to get the whole community together. And that, one of the reasons, and that area meetings and local meetings are usually small enough that you can actually have everybody in a room together. And so you don't need to sort of limit it to just a few people. We do not have a room which can cope with up to 18,000 Quakers, which I think is our current, the current size of the Quaker community in Britain. And one of the things that when we have the residential gatherings is that we need to look very carefully about basically which universities have a big enough lecture hall for us to be able to do the main things. And there have been times in the past where they haven't had one, and so we put up a massive marquee instead in the car park, and then paid to repair the car park at the end, where the divots went in. And so I do think that things like Zoom, and there was some discussion before the meeting began about the wonders of modern technology, does mean that a lot of the barriers to having the whole yearly meeting gathering together in the way that Meeting for Sufferings used to have gone. And I think that in general that's probably a good thing, because I think I see two very different. I see two sort of different models of how Quaker structures can work. One of them is where you're appointing people and having people on it because of their particular skills or experience or knowledge or something. And that I think the idea behind people say joining like a Quaker Life Central Committee or Quaker Peace and Social Witness Central Committee to oversee that work, then I know that they look particularly for friends who have an interest in those areas, or better yet, some experience or depth of insight into those areas. And if anyone is interested, then there's a Quaker service information form that can be filled out to identify what your skills and interests are. And I think that works quite well. I think that also things where you want the entirety of the community, whether that's the local meeting, the area meeting, the yearly meeting involved, then actually you do want, I think my ideal would be that you'd have as many people part of it as possible. And one of the things that I like and don't like about yearly meeting is that in my current job now, I make sure I go to all the sessions, partly to listen to what's happening, because part of my job may be to help put into practice whatever the yearly meeting does and decides. But also because you occasionally get things where a friend stands up and asks some question. They say, and the clerk say, all right, Oliver's going to answer that. And I have to, in a tearing hurry, work out what on earth I'm going to say about it. I had one time when I used about a day's worth of energy because I got asked with sort of zero notice, how are we taking forward our commitment to trans and non-binary welcome? How are we measuring the impact of the local development workers who are supporting meetings around the country? Unsurprisingly, now I have better answers than I did at the time. But it's but the value, I think the value of yearly meeting is that because you have so many people and so many friends, then you do get these sort of unexpected questions and unexpected insights that I don't get either in a small body like a central committee which only has about a dozen people in it, or actually even in a larger body like 100, like Meeting for Sufferings. So I think there is a value in that. That is a very long-winded answer, which may not have answered quite what you were saying. But let me pivot on to the other question. I think about my personal spiritual life. I think that in some ways, my spiritual life is less deep than it has been, actually. And I think that's partly because of the busyness of life. So, I have children and I have, work which is busy, not just because it's a Quaker job, but just because it's a job with lots of things going on. And so the sort of space to carve out time for that worship and reflection, I need to actively build in. And when I do that, it's very powerful. Working for Quakers is not like being like a Quaker monk or something and spending your whole day in prayer. I actually think it's more akin to being like a clerk in a business meeting. So, my experience of clerking meetings is that, well, when I've clerked a business meeting, then I've found that I don't enter into the worship as deeply as other people as I did when I'm just there as a regular member of the meeting, because you're always having to be listening out for what's being said and what's behind what's being said. And so there's that sort of keeping an awareness of the room and where the meeting is and is moving to. And I think it's in a slightly different way. It's a similar thing, working for Quakers, particularly in the sort of kind of job that I do, where a lot of what I'm about is trying to identify what Quakers are doing, what Quakers are needing, how they, and how to make that happen. Is a sort of oil, being the oil in the wheels, is how I see it sometimes. And the other thing, but one of the other things I think is I work quite hard at retaining a modicum of humility, because there's a weird thing where like Quakers can, both staff and Quakers can assume that because I have a job which is a senior job in the yearly meeting, administration, that therefore I am a better Quaker or know the answers, and they don't. And part of my job sometimes is about giving an answer, just so that people can carry on moving forward. But it doesn't mean, and hopefully I, have good answers, but I don't have the magic power of being a better Quaker. And occasionally people can sort of almost treat me as though I do. And so, one of the things that I want to make sure that whenever it happens, I finish doing this job. When I go back, then, I remember one of my colleagues talking about how when they stop doing their job, they're going to go to meeting and they're just going to make the tea and coffee and they're going to do the doorkeeping, and that's it. And they're going to do that for a year and it'll be really good for them. And I really resonate with that. And I think that, and then one other bit I'd say is that there are very few spaces in my work which feel like spiritual spaces as well as work or productive spaces. And one of them is there's a gathering which happens every few months of heads of different Quaker agencies worldwide. So like the Quaker UN Office is one of them, and the American Friends Service Committee, which is a bit like the QPSW in Britain, only like 10 times bigger because everything's bigger in America. And the Friends World Committee for Consultation, the sort of global Quaker umbrella body, and various others. And and that being a space where, partly because they're peers, partly because they're wise spiritually grounded people, and partly because we build in a significant amount of worship as well as sharing and listening and working together, it feels like a space for being able to reflect and being able to sort of consider, what is happening and why, and what are we being led to do at this time. That stepping back from the constant hamster wheel of activity, which I think is really important in any space, but certainly in one like this where I'm trying to act with faith as well as efficiency.
Yeah, thank you.
One, as I see no one else is wishing to come in at the moment, so I will ask something that I know is still quite controversial. The last time I went to yearly meeting was a couple of years ago, and I went as me, not as a children, young people's person into that. But one thing I did see, and you kind of mentioned it just now, there was so much anger about the trans thing. It it kind of seemed to spill over from the central meeting in session, and I don't think it was handled too well because those at the front, those at the bench at the front, seem to want to kind of move on from it. Yes, we've answered that. Now we're moving on to other thing. Which I don't think was handled too well. Is that going to be the next crisis for friends in England, or is it just something which is going to bubble over and disappear sometime?
So I think I know that specific incident that you're talking about because I was also there, and the and I think there's an element there actually around our discipline as a business method, and as a faith group which actually doesn't have we're unusual among like sort of mystical groups or Christian mystics and other faith mystics of not having a well-defined way of doing our main spiritual practice, our main religious activity. You go and you sit down, but there's actually no guidance about what you're doing when you're sitting in worship. No single way that it happens. The place where we do have that quite clear, specific guidance is actually with our business meeting and the Quaker business method and what you do and how you do it and who gets to speak when and what you do with the clerks of doing a particular thing. And so I think that's not just a business practice; it's also a spiritual. But in terms of, and I think that actually not all friends at yearly meeting are well versed and strong on Quaker business method. It's one thing where actually the Young Friends General Meeting is exceptionally good at it because every time they hold a meeting, there are new people, and so they always do an introduction to Quaker business method so that people know. And it's really, and I started doing it in a meeting where I was clerk, because also you can be well versed in it and sort of get lazy as well as brand new and not know what on earth is going on. But in terms of trans welcome and inclusion, it isn't. I mean, it is. I think it is an ongoing issue. I think it's one, and I think it's partly because there are Quakers who have, strong views and lived experiences, but but it's also influenced by the wider society. So, I think that among Quakers, I don't think there are particularly good figures for either the number of trans people in Quakers or in society at large. But my working assumption is that we've got more trans friends than you'd expect for a group of our size, because we are known for being a faith group which is welcoming to LGBT people, and I think that's really good. I think everybody needs a space where they feel welcome and they feel at home. So in life in general, but in faith in particular. and therefore you have people for whom, wanting to be and feel welcome, particularly in a wider world which is becoming more hostile, is really important and really powerful. One of the two other bits I'd say on this, one of them is about that quite a lot of the discussion about, trans welcome and women's rights and so on in Quakers at the moment is happening in quite a secular way. A lot of the arguments are the same arguments that you would hear in society at large. And actually, as a faith community, there's something, then there ought to be something, some other dimension that's there and is included. Not least because I think that will help us as a Quaker community to navigate it well. The other thing I'd say is that when I first arrived in doing my job about 6.5 years ago, then at that time Quaker Life Central Committee were trying to do a sort of consultation and gathering of stories from Quakers about their experience around gender diversity, I think is the phrase they were using at the time. And you had various people with different answers. I read them all. But of the people who were talking about their personal experience, this is me in my life. There was a very significant number of people who said, I'm trans, who were talking about, I felt like I was living a lie. I felt like I couldn't be who I was. This sort of traumatic hiding almost, and also, and when I did come out, then people being horrible and hateful to me. And of the people who were, gender critical, self-described, sort of, who were talking about their personal experience, there was a very strong trend of people who had been the victims and subjects of male violence, and so this fear of this being a way to sort of have, for the violence to come back. And I think there is something about, because there are experiences of trauma among everybody who feels very strong, for many of the people who feel strongly about it, that being something which doesn't usually get spoken about in a public space, because you don't talk about things like that to anyone and everyone in public debates. But if it's something that is a powerful underlying reason and motivation for for why you feel what you do so strongly, then actually you won't fully resolve where people are without acknowledging or engaging with that in some way. And I think it's a bit like the when I was talking about the Geneva quiet diplomacy work, that's something where trying to making people comfortable enough to have uncomfortable conversations, making people comfortable enough to be open and honest about what's going on behind what they want. Potentially it has some lessons for sort of having respectful, helpful conversations about this in the future.
Thank you. It's a touchy subject still. And anybody perhaps who hasn't spoken at all would like to express a view or not, as the case may be. Michael.
Well, first, can I apologise for joining the party late in time? I was doing other things and had actually been to the dentist, so my speech is slightly slurred because I'm still numb across the jaw. But it strikes me, I'm really interested to see you, Oliver, and to meet you on the wires. The essence seems to me that Quaker worship, meeting for worship, is that central core of what we have. And however it's partaken in, and there are many ways in which we all celebrate meeting for worship, depending on what part of the world you're in. But I think that's such an essential guide where the spirit and the spiritual life weaves its way in, and it comes out through the unexpected. And that is just the wonder and the beauty and the scariness sometimes, because it's obviously challenging and sometimes discomforting. But the discomfort is for us all to bear and to hear. So yes, I'd be interested to hear. You mentioned Geneva and the work at QUNO, and I didn't, because I'm late, I didn't catch whether you've been involved in that yourself. Is that right? Yes, yes. Very interesting. Yeah. And your issues about clerking. By Jove! Well, I'm a co-clerk at Redland, and it's a task to learn. And I've done some online stuff through Woodbrook, but yes, it's a test in listening very carefully, isn't it, to what people are saying and trying to encapsulate that in the most appropriate way when it's written down. And there are some excellent clerks who've seen at yearly meeting. I can't remember the name, but there was one woman who was marvellous a couple of years ago. Was able to breadth of understanding and listening experience. It's wonderful to see. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see in the future remaining working with Friend Central, or doing something else, or going and going as what is it? As a bloke once said, going and tending your own garden.
I don't know. I mean, like, this is still work that I mean, this is the most sort of intense job I've done by a distance, and but but also one that stretches me and grow, where I can feel myself growing still after 6.5 years doing it. I don't really know what comes after. I did say, when I applied for the job, now I felt like I might be a bit underqualified for it, but I also thought it's the kind of job which only comes up every about 10 years. And so I ought to have a go, because otherwise I might be waiting for a while. And that being the case, that, it's not something where I want to stay forever, because I also feel there's a sort of a bit like nobody stays in a nominated role in a meeting forever. That there aren't that many like exciting, senior Quaker jobs around, and I need to not hold on to them for too long. Also, there's a point at which I'll be becoming stale, and actually what is needed is someone else with sort of fresh approaches and fresh ideas. So I'm I don't bother trying to think about what comes afterwards, because to a large extent, like, it just depends what's happening and what's available and what jobs there are around when you're looking for jobs. And there's probably some amazing jobs which have gone by in the last 6.5 years, which I'd have loved to have done, but I wasn't looking because I was busy doing this one. But I mean, working for Quakers or not, I'd still expect to be around, and doing things locally. I'll have an at least 2-year ban on doing any centrally nominated work after I finish being a staff member. But in my case, because I've been so involved in so many things, it's probably going to be a lot longer. It'd be really unfair to have like the previous person around, sort of looming over your shoulder. And there are many other things that many other ways that people's gifts and services can be used beyond doing central committee work for the yearly meeting. Yeah.
and something that you may not wish to answer if you don't want to, but do say so, because I am a nosy old person, as my family would tell you quite seriously. What does your partner think about you dashing all around and being sometimes not with the children? Because a member of my meeting, his partner says you spend far too much time there, dear.
So I actually work. I mean, she's also Quaker in it, and which helps. We actually work very hard to make sure that it's not I'm always gallivanting about and she's at home with the kids. Partly because she works and has her own responsibilities, partly because I think that's part of the fairness and equality. And also, when I was growing up, my dad worked for himself largely, and so was around quite a lot. It was very nice having a dad who was there more than just bedtimes and weekends. And so, trying to make sure that I'm also available and doing that part of life. And when I was applying for this job, I asked for an informal discussion beforehand with Paul Parker as recording clerk and my boss, my direct manager, and was asking about doing it. And he said he was really keen for this job to be able to be done by someone with small children. My predecessor had done it, who was doing it. It was like her last job before retirement, and not wanting it to be a job that you just had to do at the end of your career. And so we've worked on working out what things are priorities. If there are things where sometimes actually family is priority, then enabling that. Having other people around who can also do that, which also builds in redundancy if I go onto the proverbial bus. Having other colleagues who can cover for me on various things, and but then also having noticed one of the advantages of this role is that most of the things you do are known in advance. All the committees and committee weekends and meeting for sufferings and yearly meeting, those are planned and advertised months ahead, so we can coordinate and plan. The things which come about of nowhere, where suddenly like the police break down the door of Westminster Meeting House, and suddenly you need to go on the radio at 2 hours' notice or something like that. Those are the bits where you need to scramble, but otherwise, we seem to be making it work okay.
Great.
Thank you, my friend. That was informative as ever. Once again, friends, any further comments from or questions even? No. Right then. I've got a list here this time, Patsy. I know some next week. Isn't that amazing?
Can you hear me? Because I've been so quiet because everything's been coming in and out all the time. So if you can hear me, put your hand up if you can't hear me. Otherwise, yes, next week, Kate Cashmore is going to be talking about circle dance, its physical, social, and spiritual benefits.
Great.
Right. We shall await that with interest. But apart from that, go forth, friends, and have a pleasant rest of your day.
Yeah. Thank you, Oliver. That was great.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Oliver.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciated it.
Yeah. Great.